Thanks very much. So my job over the next 20 minutes or so is to convince you that biodiversity, here we go already, sorry. Biodiversity is a good thing for human health because it suppresses the emergence of infectious diseases. And we've already seen at this conference a very good example at the Welcome to Country of the value to the children and the grandchildren that Carl requested a biodiverse environment for them to learn about their totem animals and so on. We also know, because we're ecologists and natural resource managers, food, water and fuel are sort of the basic ecosystem services that humans depend on. Without healthy ecosystems to provide those, obviously we're not going to be very well off. So I'm not going over those things. I'm going to focus on a little bit more difficult to demonstrate aspect of the value of the ecosystem services that are provided by a biodiverse, well-functioning ecosystem. And that's in this area of disease suppression, more specifically emerging infectious diseases. So the sort of thought process that I follow when I go through this is to look at the environmental change, generally anthropogenic, sometimes naturally, but most often of this unfortunate nature, the impact that has on biodiversity loss as a surrogate, I guess, for ecosystem function. Biodiversity per se is not the essential thing, but it's a very good metric for assessing ecosystem function, and it's fairly mediagenic as well compared to ecosystem function. So let's stick with biodiversity. The human disease outcome that then produces. So this is the scheme I'll be presenting for 3 different disease systems to try and convince you that this is the case. I'll talk a little bit about Lyme disease, Ross River virus, and then the infectious risk from having a suppressed immune system. And for those who want to go to sleep because it's all too much and too early in the morning and you hadn't had your coffees because the queue is too long, the take-home message obviously is going to be conservation of ecosystem function decreases disease risk. So what's good for the environment and what's good for human health, you can find solutions that support both. I'll come back to that at the end, obviously. So if we go to the first example, and I've picked this because it's one of the first described, well-documented, quantified examples of this relationship by Richard Ostfeld in the US. 25, whatever it is, 35, time seems to fly as you get older, but whatever. In the 70s, this new disease emerged in the US with these typical sort of target lesion rashes on people who'd been hiking through the forest. And it took a good decade before the pathogen, the infectious bacteria that were responsible for that disease, with people getting aches and pains, sometimes for quite a long time, and recurring, relapsing. It took quite a while to find the bugs that were responsible for that, and also the vector responsible for transmitting those to people, which is this tick here. We have these ticks, different species, but same genus of ticks in Australia, and you can see the nymph there is pretty small. They're pretty hard to find. Most people here, I'm sure, would have had ticks at some stage. Queenslanders are well aware of them because of the paralysis tick. So this particular tick, by way of illustration, we don't have this exact species or pathogen here, but what happens is the larval ticks eat blood from mice that they find in the forest, and they then drop off once they've had their blood feed and molt, use the energy from that blood feed to molt and grow into their next stage. They become nymphs. And they then have a different host range. They will then drink the blood from a whole variety of animals. And this is the stage that they usually get infected because their immune systems are receptive to those Borrelia pathogens that are carried by the mice. But only the nymphal ticks that eat blood from the mice get infected. Okay, the ones that eat these other creatures don't get infected. So they drop off their host again, molt again, and eat their final host, which is the deer. So the adults suck blood mainly from deer and complete their life cycle in that way. Now, interesting thing, if you've got an old growth forest with natural biodiversity, as would have been the case before European colonization of the US, there would be wolves eating these deer and you wouldn't have lots of deer, and that would keep the numbers of ticks down. There simply aren't as many deer for the ticks to feed on. You've also got this dilution effect. So with the numbers of hosts available here to eat, it's only a small percentage of the ticks that become infected, the ones that eat this mouse. By having a biodiverse environment, you're diluting the availability of the pathogen to the ticks. So you've got a lower percentage of infected ticks and you've got a lower number of ticks if you've got a natural biodiverse environment. So more ticks if you lose that biodiversity, and a higher percentage infected if you lose that biodiversity. Dilution hypothesis and pure competition and predation regulates the number of ticks that are infected with the pathogen, and that in turn reflects the risk of people being bitten by an infected tick. Not surprisingly, you can see this happening. The disease is concentrated. This is the number of human cases, and it's concentrated around where all of that deforestation and megacity activity has occurred. So what's happened in summary? Deforestation, biodiversity loss. We talked about the wolves. We talked about the dilution hypothesis. The other thing is that the regrowth forest is at exactly the right height for the deer to eat. So you get many more deer and more deer ticks from that as well. Very complex ecology, which I guess is why it took some time to elucidate, but the net result is an increased risk of human disease. So conserving biodiversity decreases the risk of this disease emerging. Biodiversity was lost and the disease emerged. Emerging infectious diseases, incidentally, are almost self-explanatory. It's all the things like Aedes and SARS and Lyme and Ebola that suddenly seem to come out of nowhere. Of course, they've been there all the time, but people haven't been infected with them. So once you get this sort of scenario, they emerge, and that's the label that public health people use. So that was example number one. Let's go to number two now, Ross River virus, because that's local. I'm sure people here have had Ross River virus or know people who have. It's the number one arbovirus in Australia. Arbovirus just stands for arthropod-borne virus. There's a whole variety of different viruses that are carried by mosquitoes most notably, but also ticks in some cases. So we get about 5,000 cases nationally of Ross River virus in Australia. And as I've just said, it seems to be a re-emerging disease in that we're getting more and more of it. The typical symptoms, for those who have had it, you'll recognize this. There's a sort of a classic rash. I did have slides of rashes on more interesting body parts, but the organizers convinced me that discretion was the better part of valor in this case. You get the constitutional symptoms, fever, aches and pains everywhere, and you can develop a sort of a recurring post-viral syndrome if you're unlucky. Generally, it resolves in about 6 weeks and you're fine again. It never kills anyone, but being off work for 4 to 6 weeks at 5,000 cases per annum is still quite a significant disease burden and economic cost to the country. So what happens if you ignore this left-hand side of the slide just for the time being? This is what happens naturally. You've got a virus in a macropod reservoir population. They have co-evolved, so the kangaroos don't suffer any joint pains or fever or rash, or at least they never complain about them. And the mosquitoes pick up the virus from a kangaroo and infect a next non-immune kangaroo. Now that's an important point because you need a large population of joeys who are non-immune. Most of the adult kangaroos who are hopping around being bitten by mosquitoes for years and years will have already been infected with Ross River virus and they'll be immune. So you need a continuous supply of non-immune hosts, which means you're dependent on the environment. So when there's lots of rain and it's warm and the grass is green and the kangaroos eat lots, they release the whole joey production cycle, and you're at increased risk of Ross River virus in those years. So if you go up that chain, you can work out how that disease or virus is transmitted enzootically. That means in the animal population, and in outbreak years when the conditions are right, you get an epizootic. So they're exactly the same terms as we use for epidemic and endemic in human, but we're referring to the animal reservoir population. So that's what's happened in evolutionary terms. Normally, that's what should happen. What happens if you introduce a person, either with Aboriginal colonization more than 40,000 years ago, or European colonization subsequently 200 odd years ago, suddenly there's another host available for the mosquito to bite, and if these non-co-evolved recipients of the virus get infected, then they become symptomatic. They can't treat, the immune system can't treat the virus in the same way, and they get sick and they get sore joints. So when that happens continuously, you've got an endemic situation, and when it happens periodically, like summer peaks, that's an epidemic situation. How does that tie in with the biodiversity thing? As follows. When you've got deep-rooted vegetation sucking up water, as was the case before deforestation, that kept the groundwater level down. Okay, so the evapotranspiration, reducing the groundwater level, kept the groundwater away from the historically deposited salt. If you cut this down and replace it with shallow-rooted vegetation like a crop, then you get the groundwater rising, it dissolves the salt, it kills the rest of the vegetation that's available, and you get this sort of desertification. So dryland salinity. Many of you will be familiar with that. That's a mosquito trap sitting here to see what lives in this human-made desert. Pretty extensive problem. A lot of the work I'm presenting was done in Western Australia, but you've got dryland salinity problems in most states, and they have a huge economic cost insofar as they lose your agriculturally productive land. And the question we're asking here is whether there's also a health effect from that. You would have guessed that there is, and when you get these salty pools of water standing around that were not there before, when you had the deep-rooted vegetation sucking up the water, mosquitoes who are salt tolerant, this particular species is a rock pool breeder, a coastal rock pool breeder in brackish water, and with the sudden availability of these brackish water areas inland, it can invade inland. And that's exactly what happens. Andrew Jardine did his PhD on this and came up with the following sort of table that shows the anthropogenic environmental change, the health outcome, and importantly, the ecological linkage mechanism in the middle. This is where the research contribution from the biological sciences integrates the environmental science with the human health outcomes. So that's saying land clearing, water table rising, salinisation of freshwater ecosystems, as we've just said. The salinisation leads to a decrease in biodiversity because not all of the species in there are halotolerant. That reduces the number of critters competing with mosquitoes in the water body, and it reduces the number of predators eating the mosquitoes in their water bodies. And that means the mosquito populations can boom, increased probability of a single mosquito species becoming dominant in that ecosystem. And if that happens to be a vector mosquito, as is the case here with Aedes camptorhynchus, you have an increased risk of vector-borne disease, Ross River virus, and an increased human disease burden. So cutting the long story short, if you clear the land, the people get sick. That is substantiated by work of another PhD student, Scott Carver, who's now a lecturer in zoology at University of Tasmania. He drove around Western Australia sampling every saline water body he could find and did some community ecology and showed that predator diversity decreases with salinity. So, you know, it's not rocket science, but to actually have the quantified relationship in the context of that big diagram is quite important. So the more salt you add, the more predators drop out, and the greater the probability of the mosquito population booming. So what's happened there again? In summary, it's the same scheme. Cut down the trees. This time you get soil salinisation, and the ecological linkage mechanism, the biodiversity loss in this case, is through the decreased biodiversity in the freshwater ecosystem with the predator loss, the competition loss, booming mosquito population, and you get more people with Ross River virus infection and sore joints and very unhappy. If you transpose that model into an urban environment, because you've obviously got biodiversity loss in this sort of environment as well, you can see this is before the new oval was built. If you say urbanization as the anthropogenic environmental injury that results in biodiversity loss, there's obviously not as much biodiversity in the city, does that have the same effect? That's a PhD just being written up by Emily Johnson at the moment, who's looked at that relationship in Adelaide. Okay, so that brings us to the final example, which is of immune dysfunction. What happens normally is that you acquire a set of microorganisms with which you have co-evolved. So Biwa has just told us about how important that is to a koala for digesting its eucalyptus tree, and it's just as important to humans to prime the immune system in a way that allows us to combat infectious disease and to avoid things like allergies, asthma, etc. So with the appropriate priming of the immune system by these microorganisms, it improves your health. It makes you refractory to immune diseases and infection. This is what's supposed to happen. This is how do you acquire that co-evolved commensal microorganisms, the microbiome. I should add here, the microbiome is just a technical term for the complete genetic picture of the microbial diversity present. And we've only been able to measure that in the last 5 to 10 years with next-gen sequencing. So that's why this research is now coming to the fore, because it's been simply not technically possible to do it before. So microbiome, for our purposes, is pretty well synonymous with the diversity of microorganisms present. So a baby born through the normal way, birth canal, gets covered with stuff. And there are microbes in that stuff, what are good for the baby. It then feeds on non-sterile breast milk and eats soil, because that's what kids do. And all of that exposure to the environmental microbiome gives the baby its intestinal microbiome, which it needs in order to be refractory to immune disease and infection. So if you take that away, the environmental change, if you like, it's well known that babies born by caesarean section and who feed on sterile formula milk are more prone to infection and immune disease. They're not as healthy. So that's well known. What has not been studied to nearly the same extent is the environmental microbiome. So by exactly the same argument, if this is how we've evolved, more or less, kids running around in the environment doing stuff, there is an environmental microbiome exposure that, again, primes and enhances immune function in a much more effective way than growing up in this sort of environment. And one would expect, therefore, that these kids would have more asthma, allergies, infections, and immune dysfunction-related diseases. And this is at the very cutting edge of research in this field. The birth and gastrointestinal aspects have been well studied, the environmental aspects have not. And this is really important for our purposes, obviously, because if you're talking about preserving national parks, for example, that people can use for recreational purposes, this would be health-giving if this relationship holds. And that would be a very important advocacy tool for preserving biodiversity and natural environments. Lots of other good reasons for doing so, obviously, but if voters are getting sick, that tends to be a very powerful tool to convince politicians to preserve biodiversity. So Craig Liddicoat put this slide up in his talk yesterday to show where the very early stages of this research is at, and with no expectation that you can read it, there is a list of environmental attributes that he's acquired from existing data sets down the left-hand side, and he's looked at a whole range of respiratory outcomes from the very good disease surveillance databases that we have, and done some fancy statistics, and this little blob here shows that there is a strong relationship between species richness and a reduction in respiratory infections and hospital admissions. Right? So biodiversity exposure is protective of respiratory health. That's what this graph shows. And that justifies the type of work we are trying to do now with collaborators in China. So if we go back to the sort of standard scheme, the environmental change, what's the injury to biodiversity exposure? In this case, it's urbanization, and the Chinese have that on a massive scale. Megacities growing rapidly with children not exposed to their natural microbiome. That biodiversity loss, if it results in human health, we have no better natural experiment to look at that than we do in China, because the control to that would be people living in a rural environment who are still fertilizing their home gardens with human effluent. And the range of exposures is one of the key things in an epidemiological study to make it powerful, as is the number of people, which they also have, plus because of their very advanced health surveillance systems, they have really good health outcome data. So we're collaborating with Chinese colleagues at Communicable Disease Center China to try and test whether we can substantiate this relationship and also quantify it. Because if we can quantify it, we can convince Treasury that conservation of ecosystem function, biodiversity conservation decreases the risk of disease. There's a lot of money going into biodiversity conservation and restoration, and there's even more money going into the health budget, which drains everything, as you know. So if we can find interventions that support both biodiversity conservation and keep people healthier, that would seem to be an intelligent investment. And if we can quantify the relationship in a way that convinces Treasury, I think that should be good for the environment and good for people concurrently. There is one sleight of hand here, which I have to acknowledge before finishing, which is sort of the flaw in deductive thinking. What I've shown you, English is a second language, whatever, the relationships here are all a result of the loss of biodiversity having an adverse health impact. Now, I've done a leap of faith then and assumed that restoring biodiversity will benefit health. Now that as yet has not been demonstrated. So again, this is the cutting edge of research in the field. What we will try to do with our Chinese colleagues and possibly collaborators at Playford Council, who are quite interested in this as well, is seeing whether putting ecosystems back and monitoring the microbiota improves the health of the people exposed to those restored ecosystems. So it's taking the natural experiment, we stuffed up the ecosystem and there was an adverse health outcome. We're turning that around and seeing whether restoring ecosystems actually makes people healthier. And that will be a really powerful advocacy tool. So that's what we're trying to do now. I'll finish on that point and happy to take any questions we have time for.